people understand that there's an answer, there's a way. We the people have to say. So send the orders to prepare, that we the people do declare. Send the good news, send the word, we the people will be heard. We the people everywhere. There's a message in the air.
No human being is illegal. Words have meanings, don't they? These people are illegal, or are they refugees seeking asylum? An important difference. Actually, tens of thousands of them are coming here from Central America, seeking asylum because of the drug warfare that's going on in their country, where children are being forced in order to join the gangs, run drugs, whatever the situation is. We have an obligation, don't we? That whole system of drugs, the magnitude of it, is based on the need or the desire, or whatever the proper words are, of citizens and people living in the United States of America. If we could get our minds wrapped around this idea that we are the cause of all of those deaths, Mexico and elsewhere, in Central America and South America, wherever the drug dealers have been, the drug cartels, if we had the gumption to decriminalize drugs, tax them in some way to control that, if we had the gumption and the honesty to admit that great numbers of us are addicted, if we had the gumption to fess up and say we have a responsibility not only to our own people and to the families who are affected by addiction, but also an obligation to humanity at large, where these drugs are produced and where they're trafficked. Had we ever thought about that? What a novel idea, isn't it? Some way to get around this situation. Actually, all of these thousands of children have come recently. The mothers bringing their children escaping violence. They are seeking asylum. They're called illegal because it's convenient politically. Now, this is in this copy, there's old Willie Nelson on the cover of Rolling Stone. And here is an article, and we ought to be thinking about this. The GOP's fake border war, by stoking fears and blocking Obama's every move on immigration, the far right has used the refugee crises for short-term political gain while ignoring the suffering of thousands of children. And this is the first photograph we've seen that shows the situation. We've talked and we've reported about the trains that come up through from south to north in Mexico. This is a photograph of how people ride the trains, hanging on, riding on the roofs, on those platforms. There are people, adults, who prey on the children, who rape them, rob them, kill them. There are instances reported where children are dropped between the cars as the train is moving. So what chance do they have? None whatsoever. All of this related to drugs. Here's a situation where young teenagers, really still children, and you come to when we realize that they don't know the effects of what they're doing. They're too young. Their brains aren't fully developed. They have some idea of what's going on, but look how they're kept in detention. It's difficult to see, but we get an idea. This is a wall cutting across property, keeping people from coming into the United States. That's over 600 miles long. In politics, there are only two groups. You can always rescue, says one D.C. insider, war widows and orphans. How have we screwed this up beyond me? Orphans, people in need, have always had the attention of Congress, both parties. What have we done? Not only to these people, but what have we done to ourselves as a nation? Are we thinking about that? Anyway, detention. We have families being detained in warehouses. The report on Democracy Now! There are 63,000 that are on a fast track, women, mothers, and children, to be deported back to those countries, fast track. That's the president's focus. There was a reporter, Megan Jordy, an attorney, and Renee Felton, a producer for Democracy Now!, that visited two of these detention centers in Texas. Every child I saw looks incredibly emaciated and had hollow-looking eyes. Children are not eating. Children were getting very sick. An attorney who works on immigration, who helps people, first-hand report. There are trailers called pods. There are bunk beds in them, in the rooms. 8 people are crammed into those rooms, just being held. One mother reported, one mother was interviewed by Miss Jordy, the attorney. Mother said her child hadn't eaten in 6 days. And the attorney said the child looked as if it was dying right in front of them. Now, there's a high fence around one of these places, covered with vinyl. People can't see what's going on. The attorneys are volunteering, they're immigration-focused attorneys. In one community in Texas, working day and night, trying to help people. Children who have legal representation have at least a chance. How can we expect an 8-year-old child to know what to say to a judge? Probably terrified. We can expect that, can't we? Also reported, at least one child, 3 years old, coming on their own. Imagine that. Well, undoubtedly, it would seem that some slightly older child is looking after the 3-year-old, but there it is. What shall we do? What kind of people are we? What's the ethics of this? What's the morality of all of this? We're a big country. Our heritage from the very beginning was immigration. How many of us have family members who came to this country as an immigrant sometime in the past? How many times have we heard that immigration renews us? people coming in with fresh ideas. We all benefit. Our heritage, our very existence. Well, what shall we do? What will we do? And how many of us are concerned? Other things in the news. The situation in Ferguson in the news. A young teenager shot. Apparently 6 bullets. What were the circumstances? When will there be an investigation? There's been an autopsy. 2 or 3 additional autopsies are being planned to get some impartiality in this. Eyewitnesses, clergy, others report that the teenagers are living by the rules. There are some problems, apparently, with teenagers or adults from elsewhere. But those in Ferguson, residents, report that there's been this kind of action, treatment, for many, many years. Adults report harassment. The children are traumatized now. Impartial reports use that word, traumatized. We still have, as perhaps our most important domestic situation to consider and to change, is the racism that still resides in our country. Fear. Actually, black people, brown people, fearing the white people, and certainly the white people fear them. When we sit down and talk about things, and we get to know one another, there is no fear. We see it in our capital district. The 3 major communities, 4 we call Rensselaer, Troy, Schenectady, Albany, Rensselaer, and some of the smaller communities where there is this kind of conversation, sitting around the table, looking at the problems, drugs, killings, the police, whatever the situation is, there is not that same kind of response by the police or by the community that is fearful and marching. But the key to this is that the citizens of Ferguson are marching peacefully, and by eyewitness, impartial accounts, the police are harassing them, arresting them randomly, and even the police are referred to as soldiers. Check out democracynow.org if you want to. You'll hear the word soldiers being used. The police are in military uniforms. They're using military gear. They supposedly, in one instance, removed their gear, but now apparently they're back in that military gear with military vehicles. We need to remember that surplus, as it's called, military equipment is given to the police. We know that Homeland Security people give thousands of dollars to communities, tens of thousands of dollars to communities to buy military equipment. Our nation, from within, is becoming a war-like community that we've never seen in this country before this. Are we aware of what this means for our future? The militarization of police departments. There are two jobs. One is keeping the peace, and another job is fighting a war. Are we asking too much of the police? Which is a more important job? Is there one more important than the other? Are we paying attention that bit by bit, across this country and elsewhere in the world, the word peace is a predominant word? Difficult, but that's the word. And very recently, there was a peace conference at the Kateri Tekakwitha Shrine in Voorheesville, in Fonda, not Voorheesville, Fonda, and on the Mohawk. People, Bishop Govington was there. He's noted for his peaceful work. There's a retreat on a Friday, and on a Saturday we had public speakers talking about various issues, focusing. There's a boat cruise just between the two events. Very interesting. People taking part, people telling about what they're doing in their communities to work toward a peaceful, more peaceful existence. Civil rights discussed, a number of issues. Sponsored by Veterans for Peace. Maybe you've heard of the organization. Anyway, the situation, the question raised about Ferguson, is it over-policed and underprotected? Interesting. Well, other news items. Fighting is back in Gaza. Perhaps an overview of the situation would help us to understand. Here's a postcard that's been out for a number of years. Loss of land in Palestine from 1946 to 2009, and the situation now is even worse in a way, and we'll talk about that. Palestine, Jewish land, 1946. People coming in, buying land, wanting to establish a home. This is a result of the Holocaust. After World War II, this is what started to happen. The United Nations had a plan. The plan was that the Palestinians would be in these areas and Israel would be in these areas. Then there was a war, 1948. After that war, in 1949, and this was an Arab war, by the way. This is what Israel became. This is Palestine, and this is Gaza. Gaza once was like this, now it's like that. Now we get to 2009, and this is the situation, and these green areas where Palestinians live has been further eroded. So now these areas are much smaller and walls constructed to separate them from Israel. From this to this. Now, if we take a little closer look, these settlements are illegal settlements. It's occupied territory. And according to international law, there are certain responsibilities on the occupier in terms of the people who are being occupied. Now, Palestinian fragments, illegal Israeli settlements. Just look at that. We don't need to go into details. See for yourself. And what is the big issue? The big issue is that it's an illegal occupation. Lift the embargo, lift the blockade, whatever we call it. Hamas is there firing called rockets. Not very effective. According to international law, the occupying people have the right to resist. And that's what Hamas is doing. Now, the situation gets really tricky because that country depends on the United States of America to back it with money and political power. And there are some who say that's not right. The United States should not be doing that. That situation, as it existed and as it still exists, doesn't make any friends for us in large parts of the world. We need to be aware of that, don't we? Gaza is being occupied, blockaded, 3 sides on the land, and the Mediterranean Sea borders, and from the air, constant surveillance. Israel allows only a very limited amount of food into Gaza and a very limited supply of medicines. The food supply is controlled. The number of calories that are allotted to a person are only just enough to keep a person alive. Too little and the people will die. A higher amount of calories, the people will thrive. Now, it sounds unreasonable. It sounds incredible. It sounds unbelievable. But that is one of the things that is going on there now. Reported on Democracy Now! There's a term called mowing the lawn. That's code word for Israel going in with its military and bombing, blasting with artillery, killing people, not allowing enough supplies to come in to even reconstruct. Complete domination. And it's interesting. Israel is claiming that Hamas is harassing it. How can it really be harassment when Israel controls that territory? It's not a strange army or a strange nation. They're Palestinians. Palestinians now have a unity government. Are people being harassed, controlled? En masse? Innocent people killed, homes destroyed. Is this mass punishment? Well, something's going to have to be worked out. Noam Chomsky, the noted activist, tells you the truth. In discussions recently in Democracy Now!, used such words as hideous, atrocity, the assault in U.S. support, sadistic and grotesque limitations on food and medicine, shameful, U.S. shift could prevent the occupation or change it. Much worse than apartheid in comparison. This is more restrictive than the apartheid that existed in South Africa. And he brings up the question and the suggestion we ought to boycott them. We ought to work to disinvest any company that does business with Israel. And then there ought to be sanctions. B, boycott. D, disinvest. S, sanctions. BDS. Well, what about that? And Henry Siegman, a noted, highly respected man, a rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi, executive director of the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, Anti-Defamation League. He was worked with the Synagogue Council of America. His comments: prevent, end occupation, morality, he questions the morality of the whole thing, and a recognition that the Palestinians want a state of their own. End the occupation. Key word. Now, the Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, insists that he wants peace. Does he really want peace? When one examines his actions and what his focus is, and his focus before he took office in a book that he wrote was absolutely get the Palestinians out by any means. There was a man named Yuri Avnery. He, at 15 years old, was a terrorist. He's now a peace activist. In order to get people's attention, back in the 1940s, before the State of Israel, the Zionists were called terrorists. They were ordered by their leaders, or at least one of their leaders, to line people up against the wall and shoot them, to set an example, to create terror And on one occasion, the Palestinians called the Nakba, 700,000 fled, which is what was wanted. Do we know history? Do we understand it? Times have changed. What shall we do? Well, other things. Ebola, we want to look at a map here. It's controversial because people are in our country looking to be cured. West Africa is this part of Africa, Gulf of Guinea. Outbreak here in Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, these three countries, Nigeria, and with all the problems, Ebola, civil war, and the Haram Boko, the people who capture women, young and old. We remember that, don't we? That's still going on. Just because it's not in the front page news, it's still going on. Anyway, the question is, should these people with this disease come to the United States? Well, the reason that this disease spreads is because of poor sanitation and ineffective medical help. It can be controlled, and it has in the past, by people being mindful of sanitation, scrubbing, wearing proper clothing, medical clothes, masks, gloves, helping to control it. And the outbreaks in the past have been controlled. It's not as if these people are allowed to walk around. Some countries check the passengers as they debark from planes before they enter the country. There are things that can be done. But most of all, because it's such a horrible disease, affecting the blood, the cells that line the capillaries, the cells, the arteries, and the veins. Horrible disease. Possible cure with the two people that are in the States, and now if others come in, it'll be the same thing. We have the facilities to at least quarantine people, which is the most important single thing. And there's a debate. We'll have to see how it goes on. Franklin Roosevelt once said, in the depths of the Depression, when there were millions of people in bread lines and soup lines, you can see them in the photographs, helpless, hopeless. And he stated that the only fear we have is fear itself. We need to control, or at least be aware of that, don't we? Fear itself. Well, the situation in Egypt, according to a report, there were well over 800 people killed in Rabaa Square. It's R-A-B-A-A, Rabaa Square. That was a year ago, just past the first anniversary of that occasion. There were well over 800 killed. We had in some other groups, probably nearer to 1,000 massacred, although the number 1,000 has not been used. It's very close to that figure. still going on, harassment and the killing of people. People object to the way their elected leader, Morsi, was treated. The coup. The United States of America supports that government. It's an ally like Israel is. At some point we may wonder why we have allies that we support and back that treat their citizens the way that these people are being treated. Why do we have dictatorships as an ally? What are our values? Do we apply those values? And there's one recent example. We want Assad in Syria to be removed from office because he's killing his own people. Now, who are the people, who are the rebels in that country? ISIS, or as some people call it, ISIL. The very people that are taking over the land in Syria and in Iraq and killing people. Now, we're fighting them there once they cross the border, but we're not backing them at all in Syria. We're both sides of that fence, aren't we? If we want to call it that. What, in fact, is our national policy? Four presidents, Bush 2, Bush 1, Clinton, Obama, dealing with the situation allegedly the result of 9/11 incident, which has not been thoroughly investigated. What shall we do? What do we think? Are we expressing our concerns to our elected officials? And are our elected officials being bought as a result of campaign financing, the way it is, owing their allegiance to those whom they do not really represent in terms of being elected by the people? How shall we deal with that? There are some cartoons, but before we do that, let's look at a map, see if we can find St. Louis on the map. Missouri, where Ferguson is. Let's see now. Here's St. Louis, Missouri. And right close to St. Louis is Ferguson. So we at least get some idea where it is. In the middle of the country. Here's Chicago up here. New Orleans down through here. So Chicago's about the middle of the country. Not the exact geographical middle. But anyway, there it is. So we see that. There was an event recently in Albany County. Piece of property along the Bozenkill River, or Bozenkill River. The Bozenkill. This was Dutch territory. And streams, rivers were called kills, at least the smaller ones. So the Bozenkill runs here from Schoharie County down here to the village of Altamont and down, joins the, eventually gets to the Hudson River. An interesting piece of property. Wild, beautiful. Still have a railroad that runs along it. A railroad that goes from Altamont, well, actually from Voorheesville into the Delancey area. Photograph of the county executive, the man who's in charge of the situation. This is he. Two leading members of the family, whose land is was given as the key parcel. Some of the dignitaries that were there. Some more. Big turnout. And an interesting man, former police chief, directing traffic. At any rate, this is the land. It'll be 2 or 3 years before it's actually open to the public because the trails have to be worked out and some signage and so. But it'll happen. There'll be an opening and big ceremony at one of these days. Current issue of the National Geographic. One of the interesting stories in this, we're going to have to report. Pacific Ocean. There's some places that have been set aside as preserves. Russia has set aside a Franz Joseph Land up here in the Arctic, an archipelago of hundreds and hundreds of islands. Southern Mozambique, New Caledonia is France, the Southern Islands, Pitcairn Islands, that's where the HMS Bounty was sailed to and after the famous mutiny. Easter Island and Salas de Gomez, the Marine Park, Chile, Costa Rica. Now, we got another one here in North America that set aside. I think it was President Bush. Bush too. Anyway, the title of this article, Where the Wild Things Are. Pristine Sea projects aim to explore, survey, and help protect the last wild places in the ocean. Living laboratories about how the various parts of a healthy marine ecosystem fit together. But their number is dwindling as long as distant fishing fleets extend their reach. Now, what is going on? Overfishing, the warming and acidification of the oceans. Oceans absorb the carbon dioxide in the air. It's called a heat sink. Earth is changing as a result of climate change. Recent discussion on alternative radio regarding overpopulation on the earth. Apparently, the ideal earth population of human beings should be around 2 billion. 2 billion. We have nearer to 9 billion. People began to be concerned when it was 6 billion. Now there's something called the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity of the land means that only so many cattle, for example, can graze on an acre of land without consuming so much grass that the grass won't grow anymore. That's just an oversimplification of the carrying capacity. Land can be overused. We remember in Europe years ago during the Middle Ages, the rule was apparently use the land for 2 or 3 years or whatever the time period was and let it rest for a year or two, whatever that was. So that the land recovered from overuse. One of the big questions, do we have enough land to feed as many people as we now have on Earth? The question is, what if no young child was born? That was a rule or something, no more, or virus comes and makes men impotent. Something. Man-made or nature. What would happen to the land? The prediction, the land would recover. We wouldn't have so much land devoted to other things, but more land devoted to agriculture to provide food. And that's oversimplification. There's much more to it than that. The oceans being overfished. The carrying capacity also something to consider. In this article, in this magazine, a good part of it is devoted to, is the second of an 8 series, the use of food and the production of food. But here, the possibility that someday we'll have to cultivate edible insects. Protein, a key word. So here, different kinds of insects. Crickets. Well, salmon are not. Salmon and chicken and pigs and cows. You may have to use more insects. This is what the cost of land is. We may have to give up pigs. We have to give up some of the, or cut back on them. And the cycle of growing, it's insects, a circular economy. Now, many people do eat insects as part of their diets. Culture's based on that. We may have to consider that. Maybe we won't crunch on them, hold them in our hands and crunch on them. Maybe they'll be dried, made into a powder, that we would put on our other foods to increase the nutritional value of what we eat. Something to consider. We may have to look at reality, and we may have to consider whether being squeamish is appropriate or being realistic. Now, the article goes on. It's more than we can cover today, but we'll cover more of it as we go along. Could eating like our ancestors make us healthier? That's the big question. And an example, eating honeycomb. The essential energy for the Hadza people of Tanzania in Africa. People living in the rainforest in Bolivia. This is a photograph of a river in the Amazon, debris filled. This is a story of a chap that's a butterfly. This is the butterfly, and there's the shadow on his back. Walking, he's thin, he's well-conditioned because he walks great distances to get food for himself. And here's a chart which shows what people eat. And the world is moving more toward the diet that's similar by 36% on average. So country after country is getting to be more like our diet. And one of the big questions is the carrying capacity of the planet. Can we afford to have so much beef? Because that crop, that food is very, very, what's the proper word?
Resource intensive.
Yeah, it's nutritionally intensive, but it takes a great deal of time and energy to produce beef, where we can produce pigs for far less energy use and chickens for even less. Mauritania has made that much progress over a period of time. Just to show something, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, the United States, we don't move very far. Some of these countries in our part of the planet, the idea that countries are moving more toward this diet that revolves around meat and dairy, and it does take a big toll on Earth's resources. More of Earth's resources than one based on unrefined grains and nuts and fruits and vegetables. So that is something that we can look forward to or need to consider. What shall we do? Are we interested? How do we work together? We may notice that there's a great deal of dissent in the world. people are unhappy with the way things have been going. Here's a comment from the Times-Union. Is that a combat bombing or a ceasefire bombing? Interesting comment. This is appropriate because we see this in our part of the world. Here we go. U.S. infrastructure. It's getting harder to kick the can down the road. Now, there's a gap in that bridge. There's a gap in one side of the bridge, I-90 bridge, the Platoon Island Bridge. You can see it when the work goes on in the evenings and on the weekends. Here's a comment. Not to run your day, but John Boehner says we're part of a Democratic fundraising scam. Impeach the socialist dictator, un-American Kenyan Obama, and that's still in people's minds. Is he a citizen of Kenya or is he a citizen of the United States? That's going to be interesting to look at that as we go into the next century after this one. It may be even interesting after it leaves office to see what his accomplishments are. We need to recall, though, that we have a situation in our country where the President of the United States was targeted by the other political party so that he would not make any progress and would fail. Well, thank you for being with us. Thank Glenn Jarrett for his engineering. Be sure to help support your local people, the independent people, especially the food pantries and the food banks. The independent cinemas, the independent bookstores, especially important, the independent bookstores. And, of course, the independent bakeries and the good things like the chocolate shops and so forth. Pay attention to what's going on. Just don't sit there. Do something. Be helpful.
We the people hand in hand.
Pay attention.
We the people understand that there's an answer, there's a way. We the people have to say. So send the orders to prepare. That we the people do